Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast, dedicated to the Holy Family. I'm Thomas V. Miras. Today I'm talking to Abriana Chilelli about her successful fight against obscene advertising in Denver. Hey everyone, welcome to the show. I recently got my hands on a new collection of essays by Marc, who you may have heard of as the blogger Bad Catholic, which is a name he's gone under for several years now. I think he's one of the best young Catholic writers around right now, and I say young even though he's probably several years older than me. And when I say he's one of the best, I mean primarily in terms of his pure writing ability. He's just very eloquent, very gifted communicator. He's really clever, he's really funny, and gets across some fairly deep ideas in a pretty short amount of words. He writes very much in the Chestertonian vein, although he's gotten to the point where his writing doesn't sound like just a rip-off of Chesterton's style, but you can definitely see it in there, and he kind of acknowledges his debt to Chesterton and a lot of the other writers of the same era, like Belloc and Newman, in the introduction to the book. The collection is called A Bad Catholic's Essays on What's Wrong with the World. It's a pretty short book. Some of the essays are unique to the book, and others are taken from other publications, like one of them called Make Hell Hot Again, was originally published in First Things last year. That's a quite good essay. He sort of explores how a lot of our theologians' explanations of how hell is compatible with various attributes of God, his goodness, his omnipotence, and specifically in his article with God's ultimate and complete victory over evil at the end of time. He talks about how these explanations, even by the Church's greatest theologians, all ultimately fall short in various ways. And I think he's fairly convincing on that, but he's not saying, therefore, we should say hell doesn't exist or it's not eternal or taking the von Balthasar route or anything like that. He's just saying, look, we don't fully understand this, and he makes a good case in that essay for why it's actually a good thing, it's providential that we are unable to fully understand this and reconcile it with some of the things that we know about God through faith, in particular in terms of the call to evangelize and the need to not be complacent about these things. So I'll link to that essay in First Things if you want to get a sense of his style, and that'll be at www.catholicculture.org/episode 8. He's got a couple of really good essays on culture in there, and they take various routes to get to the point that culture ultimately is not the highest value. There's a great line in one of them, I forget the name, which essay this comes from, but he says, if it is true that the question of God transcends the importance of culture, then belief in God demands a radical generosity from every believing culture. Culture can no longer be an end unto itself. It must split open and give itself away in service to a higher value. And I think it's a challenging essay to people who are sort of scandalized by the demands, almost imperial demands that the church makes of various cultures in which it takes root. There's another great one called Celibacy in the LGBTQ Age, and how he essentially talks about how the modern world's criticism of celibacy is incompatible with its elevation of various aberrant sexual identities and, its proclamation that you can be however you want to be, and yet it still finds itself offended by the choice to not have sex. It's like you can have sex in any way and with whoever you want, but the only deviant choice is to be celibate. And not because you're asexual, not because you don't want it, because you want it and you choose not to do it. There's a great quote at the end of that essay. We want freedom as long as it's a freedom we are not responsible for. We want a political freedom not to be oppressed in our sexual identity, but not the personal freedom to say no to a feeling, desire, or drive. Another one I really liked in there is called The Divine Ascent of the Church Lady, and I won't get into that, but the title alone should make you want to read that one. And one of the most powerful ones is the final essay of the book called Religion and Changing the World, and he talks about sort of how the so-called millennials, of which I suppose both he and I are a member, have this sort of inchoate desire to change the world for the better. And he talks about how human beings throughout history in various societies have had a sense that something is wrong with human existence, that there's been some kind of fall, some sort of fundamental flaw. And Christianity, and I suppose Judaism as well, were the first to give some hope that the world could ultimately be healed and transformed for the better. So now living in a post-Christian era, young people today, they have that same sense that there's something fundamentally wrong with in our situation, and they have a desire to change it and a belief that things can be transformed. And yet, because they don't give the same diagnosis of the problem, which is sin, they ultimately tend to elevate, depending on their ideology, some specific worldly problem as the problem that explains all problems, whether it's the patriarchy, whether it's, capitalism or whatever. So basically, because they don't have a sense of the ultimate problem and the ultimate solution, which is Christ, they make these particular problems in the world infinite, so that there's an unending effort to purify the world on political and ideological terms. And you see this with progressivism in general, because there's no point, they won't even define a point at which they would be satisfied and say, okay, we've accomplished what we went for. But ultimately, because it's not the personal problem of sin that they're dealing with, these worldly problems are too big for anybody to take responsibility for. So much as his point about sexual freedom, we're abdicating our personal responsibilities in favor of political responsibilities. So even more, what you get is this situation where there's, as Nicholas Nassim Taleb puts it, there's no skin in the game. So it's like, oh, I could give a sandwich to this homeless person, but, that's not going to accomplish anything, because poverty is really caused by, class conflict and rapacious capitalists or whatever. So there's really no point in me doing anything, because the problem is ultimately structural. So when you make the problem structural, then you, to a large part, abdicate responsibility over it. And I know that, activists would say, no, each person has to get woke and not just, say it, but live it. But in practice, that's what you get, because everything is about the political position and the words that you say rather than how you actually live. But that last part is my own take on it, not what Marc Barnes says in particular. But anyway, it's a nice little collection of essays. Check out some of his writing online. I'll link to his website as well as the Make Hell Hot Again essay in First Things. Again, the title of the book is A Bad Catholic's Essays on What's Wrong with the World. Moving on, if you're a fan of Flannery O'Connor, I highly recommend checking out the 1979 film adaptation of her novel Wise Blood. It's faithful to the book, and I really enjoyed it when I watched it for the first time a couple weeks ago. Kind of an interesting story behind this movie. It was produced and written and commissioned, really, by the children of Robert and Sally Fitzgerald, who were good friends of Flannery O'Connor's. And it was directed by John Huston, who is a famous director. He did The Maltese Falcon, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, The African Queen, and a lot of other great films. I think he was 70 when he did Wise Blood, so this came towards the end of his career. So it's kind of a funny story. Brad Dourif, who you may have seen as Wormtongue in the Lord of the Rings movies, plays the main character, Hazel Motes, in Wise Blood. And as he tells it, Huston was convinced that there was not a deeper religious meaning to Flannery O'Connor's novel, that it was basically just a satire of Southern Protestantism, which it is in part, but that's far from being the whole story. But at the end of producing the film, Huston realized that he had been telling a deeply religious story. And Dourif talks about a meeting towards the end of the production, and he says, we're all sitting around the table, and Huston kind of looks up at everyone, and he looks around and says, Jesus wins. So I thought that was interesting, that the religious worldview made it into the film, even though Huston didn't really think that that was what the book was about. It came through because he was faithful to the book, regardless of his understanding of it. So yeah, definitely check that film out if you're an O'Connor fan. Like I said, it is faithful to the book, so that means there are a couple of risque parts in which you might want to retract your eyeballs. My guest today is Abriana Chilelli. She happens to be the Director of Curriculum and Instruction for the Archdiocese of Denver Office of Catholic Schools, but that's not why she's on the show today. A couple weeks ago, there were some articles in the Catholic press about this woman who had successfully shut down some obscene advertising that her kids were seeing on their school commute every day. And I didn't even read the article at first. I just saw the headline and thought, I'm having her on the show because I live in New York City. I don't have any kids yet, but this stuff just drives me nuts. So definitely wanted to get her story, and we talk about the specific practical aspects of how she succeeded in getting rid of this advertisement. So I thought that was important. I think signing petitions is generally not enough, and she did more than that. So here is Abriana Chilelli. Hi, Abriana. Thanks for coming on the Catholic Culture Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So you were driving your kids to school every day past essentially an advertisement for a strip club. So can you just start from the beginning of this story? What was the problem that was bothering you?
Yeah, so I was actually driving them home from school, but, small detail, but just in case I say that. We drove home from school every day. And we live in the city of Denver, so we live pretty close to downtown. And so we have to drive through downtown to get home from school. And outside of a strip club, there was a van advertising the club. And so there was an image of women on the van that, was pornographic in nature. And they were, from their perspective, smart about it because it was on their private property. And so they had, I don't know if you've seen these vans, but it's basically like they've taken a screen print and filled up the entire van with a humongous picture. But from their perspective, it was great advertising because it was on their property, but the parking lot, so it was parked in their parking lot, but the parking lot was right on the street. So there was no avoiding it. And it was right at a light, a very long light, actually. And so if you were stuck at that light, it was right there. You could not miss it. So free advertising for them, but unfortunately, right at my eye level and my children's eye level. So it was really difficult because all we were doing was driving home from school. And every time we would hit this light, and I would have my 4 children in the car, and my son is 9. My 2 girls are, at the time they were 6 and 3. And then I have a little baby, but we were right there at the light, and it was unavoidable for them to see it. Though for about a month, I spent the whole month just sort of in a panic trying to find any distraction I could on the street.
Yeah,
so
how would you do that?
I would just find, wow, guys, look, there's a window washer up there, and talk, for 5 minutes about window washers, hoping to divert their eyes. Right. So it was actually super tricky and super hard. Though we do that, as much as possible. If we're going down the highway and we see a billboard, well, my husband actually started it. So he'll just say, hey, guys, look over here, this cool car coming on this side of the car, just to divert their eyes as much as possible so that they're not, staring at these images that we don't want to fill their little minds with. But after about a month, it was daily that we were stopped at this light. It got pretty impossible to distract them. And finally, my little 9-year-old guy said, Mom, why do you always try to distract us at this light? Why do you always make us look at things? And then he said, is it because of that van over there? So in my efforts to distract him, he had seen it. And I said, yeah, but it is because of that van. And he said, yeah, it just doesn't look very good. So I was incredibly proud of him that he had that sense of good versus bad. And we do a lot of work with them around images. So I don't know if you read the book, Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, but it's really helpful. It's a children's book.
I think I did read that, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I reviewed that when it came out.
Yeah, I really like it because it's actually not from a religious perspective at all. It's sort of like from a cognitive perspective of what imagery does to your brain. And it just teaches them.
That's the one where it's more about teaching parents something that parents and kids can go through together, right?
Yep. So we have read that to them, and it's sort of, what do you do? It just gives them a strategy. What do you do if you see an image that's not good? So I was super proud for him to recognize that image is not good. And he had that sense of, what is true or what is good or what is beautiful, and this was violating that. But at the same time, I felt angry that he had to be analyzing that every day, despite my distractions or my effort to distract him. And that it was in his face. And I just thought, you know what? I was reminded of Archbishop Chaput, right? And asking us to be, Catholics in the public square, and that we also exist in these public spaces. Because for a whole month while I was distracting my kids, I was also lamenting the fact that this van continued to be there and that nobody was seeing a problem with it from my perspective or my lamenting, that there was seemingly no problem with this pornographic image of women and frankly, just the body, the human body, just being there and being accepted by a culture. And that to me was the saddest part, was from my perspective that nobody would care, that nobody else would be offended by it, and that surely I was alone in being just saddened by this image. So after that month of initial reaction to it, I started to just feel angry and be reminded of Archbishop Hugh calling on us to also exist in the public sphere, and also to say, you know, actually, I live here too, and I hold some truth about what the body is meant for, and that our bodies are not meant for exploitation. In fact, they're meant to be a gift to others, but not in an exploitative way. And that I just felt probably invited by the Holy Spirit is really what it was, to say something about it. So I started out by calling the police, and I thought, well, might as well try to start there. And the police officer assured me that he was very much aware of the van, but that from his perspective, the women on it didn't violate any public indecency laws, which was shocking to me that they didn't. But from his perspective, that they didn't violate any public indecency laws. And so he said that...
Did he sympathize with your perspective at all? Or was it just a technical point that he was making, or...
I don't know. It was on the phone, so it was a little hard to tell. He certainly heard the anger in my voice, and he, said all the right things. I recognize that you're upset about this, and I hear that you're upset about this, but I can't do anything about it from a law perspective. And so I was pretty upset about that. But, if he couldn't do anything about it, he couldn't do anything about it. And so I figured, you know what, that's probably not the end of the story. And so I contacted my city councilman. So my city councilman wrote me back pretty quickly within a day or two and said that while he is my councilman, the van doesn't sit in our district. So he forwarded me to the councilman whose district it was that the van was sitting in. Fortunately, I worked in public schools for a long time, and the councilman whose district it sat in has actually been in my classroom a number of times. And so I had that great in with him. And so I sent him a long email detailing what I really felt about it, that my husband and I are choosing to raise our kids in the city, that we love the diversity that it offers our children, that we love the urban lifestyle and all of the advantages that we get living in this city. And that's a choice that we're making, but that we also don't stand for the objectification of the body, and that we work really hard to teach our children that their bodies have meaning, and that their bodies are beautiful, and that their bodies are not for the exploitation or the consumption of others. And so from my perspective, that van was completely offensive, and I wanted it taken down. And so they wrote me back pretty quickly saying, we'll look into it. And I assumed that that was it, that it was just, I was being just given a canned response, and that was it. But I actually got an email, it was probably about 3 or 4 weeks later, from the councilman's aide saying that she had brought it to the Denver zoning board and that it violated a Denver zoning code. So this conclusion is a little bit disappointing, but still offers me incredible hope. So what it actually violated was that a business can't, in the city of Denver, have a parked vehicle advertising that business parked outside of it. So I'm not sure the history of that obscure zoning code, but in this case, it worked out because they were in violation of that. And so they were issued a warning. And the email communicated that I think they had 3 warnings that they would be issued before they were issued a ticket. Well, that was on Thursday that I got that email from the aide. And sure enough, by Monday, the van was gone. So while I was disappointed that it was hopeful. I was disappointed that the zoning code wasn't something around, you can't advertise using naked women on your advertisements. I would have loved if that was the zoning code, though maybe I'll take that on next. That wasn't the code, but what I realized was by saying something, I was at least able to bring enough light to what this was to get it removed. Even though this was an obscure zoning code, it at least worked in my advantage in this case. And so saying something was the impact, the lever that made that go away. So it ended up working in my favor.
Yeah, obviously we should have, there should be something in zoning codes or elsewhere in the relevant law to forbid, public obscenity or indecency. I'm sure that's more the case in some places, must be still in some towns, but something, I guess that's more of a long-term goal, as you said.
And I wonder about it. I mean, that's the one that they were citing. But in the city of Denver, we used to have, and I've seen these in other cities, basically billboard trucks, and they just drive around. And I used to see a ton of obscene imagery on those. particularly after sporting events. But I actually don't see those in Denver as much anymore. So I wonder if there is a zoning code that those were removed with that probably speaks to that indecency piece. So even though
because
they
were
cited this one,
in public spaces, right?
right, they're just driving around on the street. So I wonder if that does exist. And in this case, they just cited the advertisement piece to me, but it's worth digging around. And I think the biggest thing I learned is that it's worth it to say something and not assume that nothing can be done. And that was my biggest heartbreak over this when I first encountered it. My assumption was, who else besides the small percentage of Catholics in this city would be offended by this? Or, maybe a small percentage of people would be offended by this. So why say something? I feel like often in this culture, with this just sad reality of how our culture understands the body, I assume that I'm the only one who's concerned. And I think that this was eye-opening to see that my voice, though, is still here, even if it's in a small minority, and it's okay to use it to make some impact on what's publicly seen.
Right. Yeah. I think there's a sense among Catholics, even Catholics who are in agreement with the church's teaching on the body and sexuality. There's a sense of futility. And also, I think people are a little afraid to be seen as the sort of person who goes around, protesting and being outraged by things, if specifically because they think that it's not going to amount to anything anyway. Mm-hmm. But in your case, you didn't protest it. You actually did something about it.
Right. Yeah, actually, my husband joked. He's like, when we were waiting for the councilman to write me back, he's like, do you want me to go over there with just a black sweatshirt in the middle of the night and spray paint it off? And I'm like, no, I actually don't want you to do that. I think we can navigate. He was totally kidding, of course. But yeah, I think that just with a little savvy of who to contact and how to phrase things, I think that it worked to my huge advantage that the councilman had been in my classroom. Like, I had met the man. And so I think it just spoke to me too, like how much we need to be Catholics in the public square. And that doesn't always mean running for office, or it doesn't always mean just making sure we're voting, according to our well-formed conscience, but it also means being involved in our civic communities and building relationships and making ourselves known as Catholics living in our communities. I think that's incredibly important, and that was a huge takeaway for me.
Sure. Yeah, I can relate to what your husband said. I mean, I don't have kids, but I live in Manhattan, and this stuff just drives me crazy on a daily basis, honestly. Just the advertisements that you see on the subway, and the worst ones, I fantasize about about like tearing them down and like then getting arrested and going to court and like defending myself eloquently, But yeah, I mean, there's ads for the worst are like the sort of public service things where it's, some New York City health agency and it's, advertising for sexual health in a very like frivolous way that kind of encourages risky behavior almost. And, in the small print, it's like, anybody over 12 or over can come in here and get help from us.
Right.
And it's like, if you're going to make me pay like tax money to insulate people from the consequences of their immoral behavior, mm-hmm. at least throw me a bone and like shame them a little bit in the ad, right. Like don't insult me further by, and of course, like, harm the culture. It's not just about me, but by encouraging this behavior and making light of it in the advertisements. And it's honestly infuriating.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's their strategy, right? Normalize it, because then we can make money off of it later on. And I think that's the heart of it, really. Normalize it so that we can make money off of contraception, we can make money off of abortion, we can make money off of all of these things and further exploit people. But yeah, if I learned anything in this, it's that we also exist here, but I pay taxes here to use this road, and I don't need to see the exploitation of the body here. So I feel like write a letter, send an email to whoever's advertising on the subways there.
Yeah. Well, it might be a tall order for me to get the subway ads changed here in Babylon, but I feel like not everywhere else not everywhere else in the United States has to become New York City. That's my view. You
never know. But honestly, like Denver is a pretty liberal city, and I thought, who would possibly care what I have to say? And although, the zoning code wasn't exactly what I wanted it to be, it at least got it removed, right, on some level. My hope is that maybe there was somebody on the zoning board who was on my camp who, found this obscure loophole to get this removed. So you never know who's who and who's connected to help us out with our cause here.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I didn't consider, I didn't really know much about Denver's politics. So that's good to know.
It's also interesting because I feel like, we're coming off this MeToo campaign, or we're in the midst of it. And I just feel like that's a question that our secular society is grappling with, right? What does exploitation of the body mean? What does it mean to take advantage of the body? What are women's bodies for? Like, we're seeing the consumption of women's bodies in a violent way, and it's being brought to light everywhere with this Me Too campaign. So I feel like that's super important too. Denver's mayor, for example, it was just, caught in this scandal of I didn't follow it too closely, but this scandal of an extramarital affair and, allegations against him, alluding to sexual assault. And so I think it's super important that we're aware of what the culture is grappling with, because we speak truth to that. We have the truth to those answers. We know what's wrong and why that's happening, right? We can trace that back to the sexual revolution of why this is happening at an alarming rate. This exploitation of the body. And so we can speak truth to that. And I feel like it's super important as Catholics that we can speak the language of the culture to shed light on that. Our society is grappling for answers to that, and we have the answers. So I think that it's super timely, actually, that we're aware of all of this, and that, we've been given the gift of theology of the body, and that we've been given the gift of understanding gender and understanding the truths about the body now in this moment in our culture. So I just think it's super important that we're aware of what the culture is asking us to answer.
Absolutely. Now, earlier you mentioned when you were contacting people in the city, how it's important to have the right tone and use the right words. But you said you were angry when you first called the policeman. So how exactly, from a tact perspective and a strategic perspective, did you approach how you expressed your concerns?
Yeah, well, the police officer was actually the only person I talked to. I mean, it was over the phone, but the only person I actually talked to with my voice. With him, I didn't hold back my anger. I also never actually mentioned my faith or my religion in any of this. I kept it strictly with the words exploitation of the body, or, I didn't even use the word violating dignity, because I feel like the secular world hears our faith coming through in that and sort of tunes us out. And so I tried to use words that I heard. I followed the Me Too campaign pretty closely, followed some words that I heard from there. And so I think from a tactical perspective, again, it's super important to be plugged into the words our culture is using to grapple with these ideas. When I was talking to the police, I let my anger be pretty clear. I mean, I didn't blow up at the guy or anything. I just said, hey, I wanted to call and talk to you about the van that's at this particular intersection. From my perspective, it's incredibly offensive. And he said, yep, I'm aware of the van. So that must have been his patrol area. And so I said, well, I'm wondering why it can't be removed. From my perspective, that indecent picture should not be there at eye level for people to see on the street. I mentioned I have 3 children who can see it every day. And I said, I don't want my children seeing that anymore. And he said, okay, well, I'll drive by and I'll look at it again. But from my perspective, it does not violate any public indecency laws. And that's when I started to get angry. And I said, that's disgusting. And I said, as a woman, I don't want to see women's bodies advertised in that way. And I don't want to see women's bodies exploited on the streets. And he said, I can hear that you're angry and I understand your anger, but it doesn't violate public indecency laws. And I just kept saying, how could it not? That's absolutely disgusting that our city is allowing women's bodies to be advertised for consumption of other people. So I kept framing it in that perspective and then frankly judging it. And I think it's okay to say that is wrong. That is not right. And I think that sort of objective truth is also what our culture longs for. The police officer, again, I mean, his job is to uphold the law. So if it didn't violate a law, then it didn't violate a law. So then that's where I thought the councilman might be able to come in.
Sure. So how did you approach it when you were emailing people from a tact perspective?
Yeah, I tried to affirm the work of the councilman. So like I said, I knew this councilman. I know he does incredible work. I know he has a family. I know he has kids. So I tried to affirm his work because, again, I'm involved in our city and I know the work that he's doing. In particular, for public education, he's doing incredible things to support schools. So I tried to first affirm him so that he knew I wasn't coming at him. I don't work for the government, but I do work for the diocese. And so I do know what it can be like to receive just people's criticism. And that never works, right? When somebody leads with fault or leads with a critique. And so I tried to first affirm his work and value him. I tried to also make a personal connection. Hey, you've been in my classroom. Thank you for your support of me as a public school teacher in the city. And then I tried to frame it as we love this city because we do. And we love raising our kids here because we do. But then also present my problem. But I have 3 children and every day they're looking at the exploitation of the body simply by driving home from school. So I tried to sort of make the tail end of what my ask was after this, affirmation of his work to build that connection there. And again, I left out my faith.
Yeah, that's all really good stuff. I mean, I think I asked because I think it's important for Catholics to, it's not just important to be right. It's actually important to be effective. So
right. And I also think as Catholics, it's incredibly important to build relationships, right? Because hopefully through our relationships, we're then evangelizing, right? And then we are then building relationships and bringing people into what we believe in a beautiful way. I think a lot of times I have a lot of friends who wouldn't identify with any religion and their perspective is that Catholics are always causing problems. Like, oh, you guys just hate Obama and you don't want to pay for people's birth control. So you're just causing problems. And I think we know this from discipleship efforts, right? Like it starts with relationship actually and helping people see why what we believe is actually beautiful and true versus why what we believe is actually just going to cause you problems as a non-religious person. So I think that's important to think about framing as we're navigating these sorts of issues.
So what do you do for the diocese?
I work for the Office of Catholic Schools as our Director of Curriculum and Instruction.
Okay. So how would you connect this experience you had with your work in the school system for the diocese?
Yeah, I think that I would hope that all schools are wrestling with how do we help kids understand theology of the body and the truths of our body. An unfortunate reality that our kids are coming at us younger and younger in our Catholic schools with a distortion of what the human body is for or how we should understand it. I hope that all schools are wrestling with that, but we're certainly wrestling with it in the Archdiocese of Denver. And how do we combat that? Not necessarily combat it, but how do we form children to know the truths of their bodies starting in preschool? I don't know if you're aware, but cartoons more and more are aimed at gender ideology and expressing those beliefs to children. And that's intentional, right? That movement is doing that at a younger age because they're trying to form children's minds. And so I think that we got to get really smart about forming children's minds at a younger age to understand our bodies have meaning and they're given to us as they are, male or female, for a very important reason, as a self-gift. And that is different than any, stereotypes about what it is to be a man or what it is to be a woman, that our bodies actually communicate truth by their physical makeup of what they are, and helping children articulate that and understand that.
Yeah, it's difficult because, before you hit puberty, that difference is less accentuated to a certain degree. It's hard to make children understand some of these things, and you have to come at it, I guess, in a more general way, in a way that they can relate to. It's difficult, but it's also so necessary. Aside from what you just mentioned as far as gender ideology, the reason I liked that book, the Good Pictures, Bad Pictures book we mentioned earlier, is that it's just necessary. Your kids are going to encounter pornography. There's just no getting around it. If I did when I was a kid, then so much more the case. And we know this statistically that it's happening at certainly before the age of 10. I don't know what the statistics are now for, at the average kid's first exposure to
I think I heard
pornographic
9.
images. Yeah. So, often it's happening before puberty. So we just don't have the luxury of sitting back and letting nature take its course, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think that, it's super important, not necessarily, I wish I hadn't used the word combat before, but to be forming children's understanding of the truths of the body. So I think it's in little things, right? Not an overt, let's sit down and talk about all the parts of your body at 4 years old. That's not completely necessary, but even in language about what's for girls and what's for boys, I think that is moments that we can talk about our body. So it comes up with my children all the time. You can't like that because you're a girl. Well, is that what it means to be a girl, that you like dolls? Or what tells us that you're a girl? Or what tells us that, our bodies tell us that, right? Just these little realities that I think are super important in just forming that understanding of what our bodies are for and how they communicate truth.
Yeah, and I know why you corrected yourself there on the word combat, because it's just, again, because of the age, it's not possible to, or good to address it directly unless you absolutely have to because of some kind of, horrible situation. So, well, I think that pretty much wraps it up. Is there anything else you wanted to touch on?
No, I think I'm good. Oh, somebody asked me recently, like, how do you connect gender ideology with what you saw in the van? And I don't know if that is lost on you. I hope not. But
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I just think it's all so super connected, right? And it's all, almost sequential to me, like that. What we see on the van is communicating that our bodies are for exploitation and that our bodies are for consumption. But the more that we can communicate to the world that actually our bodies are for a gift, as a gift for others, it's a way that we can serve others and be for others.
And they're given to us.
Yeah, the more that I hope that our world can start to understand that and see that as a beautiful truth, because they're grappling and they need some truth.
All right, great. Well, thanks so much for coming on and telling us your story, Abriana.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Today's excerpt is from Pope Francis's apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia. Yeah, sue me. In this passage, Pope Francis is quoting liberally from St. John Paul II. To those who fear that the training of the passions and of sexuality detracts from the spontaneity of sexual love, St. John Paul II replied that human persons are called to full and mature spontaneity in their relationships, a maturity that is the gradual fruit of a discernment of the impulses of one's own heart. This calls for discipline and self-mastery, since every human person must learn with perseverance and consistency the meaning of his or her body. Sexuality is not a means of gratification or entertainment. It is an interpersonal language wherein the other is taken seriously in his or her sacred and inviolable dignity. As such, the human heart comes to participate, so to speak, in another kind of spontaneity. In this context, the erotic appears as a specifically human manifestation of sexuality. It enables us to discover the nuptial meaning of the body and the authentic dignity of the gift. In his catecheses on the theology of the body, St. John Paul II taught that sexual differentiation not only is a source of fruitfulness and procreation, but also possesses the capacity of expressing love, that love precisely in which the human person becomes a gift. A healthy sexual desire, albeit closely joined to a pursuit of pleasure, always involves a sense of wonder, and for that very reason can humanize the impulses. Okay, thank you as always for listening to the Catholic Culture Podcast. You can find the show notes and all relevant links for this episode at catholicculture.org/episode 8. If you enjoyed this episode and you know someone else you think might enjoy it or benefit from it, please share it with them. You can follow the podcast at facebook.com/CatholicCulturePodcast and on Twitter at CathCultPod. Hey, I was not present at the foundation of the world, folks. You can always send me an email at podcast@CatholicCulture.org. Any kind of feedback is welcome. Feel free to suggest a guest or a topic you'd like me to discuss on the show. See you next week.